My name is Isa Contreras, and today I will be talking about the most complex organ in the human body and the number one psychostimulant in the world, caffeine, also known as 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine. One of the main sources of caffeine comes from coffee beans. Around a third of all the world's coffee is produced in Brazil. Americans consume 400 million cups of coffee per day, and worldwide it is estimated that 2.25 billion cups of coffee are consumed. It is a $32 billion industry in the United States. Another common source of caffeine is from tea leaves. It is a $10 billion industry in the US. Caffeine is a plant alkaloid, and it can be found in over 60 plants. It was first synthesized by Hermann Emil Fischer in 1895, and today it can be found in many products: soda, chocolate, and most often sought after in energy drinks. So why talk about caffeine in the brain? To answer this question, we must first answer, how do drugs get into the brain? Drugs do not affect the brain the same way they may affect other parts of the body. The brain is a very exclusive organ. From over 7,000 drugs on the Comprehensive Medicinal Chemistry Database, only 5% of all drugs treat the CNS. Why is this? This is due to the protective nature of the blood-brain barrier. Not everything gets through. Small molecules generally cross the blood-brain barrier if the molecular mass of the drug is less than 400 to 500 daltons and the drug forms less than 8 to 10 hydrogen bonds with solvent water. As for caffeine, it is around 194 daltons. In comparing it to other drugs, we can see that caffeine is smaller than drugs such as cocaine. So, can addictive properties be predicted on the basis of how readily drugs cross the blood-brain barrier based on size? In other words, will smaller molecules that can cross more be more addictive? The answer is no. Here we see that based on size, more caffeine can get through the blood-brain barrier than cocaine, but cocaine is more addictive than caffeine. So just because a drug may more readily pass the blood-brain barrier, it does not necessarily mean it is more addictive. Another important characteristic of caffeine is that it is lipophilic, meaning that it can cross the lipid cell membrane at the blood-brain barrier. Its polar oxygen-nitrogen molecules make it hydrophilic enough to travel in the bloodstream, and the methyl groups make it more hydrophobic, therefore allowing it to be fat-soluble. Its small size and lipophilic quality makes caffeine an ideal candidate for crossing the blood-brain barrier. So, now that we know that caffeine can cross the blood-brain barrier, this makes caffeine pretty special. So let's take a closer look at the history of caffeine in society and drug action at a molecular and neurobiological level. Caffeine in humans go all the way back to the Stone Age. Tea has been traced back to the 2nd century BC as well. In the 11th century, coffee was discovered in Ethiopia. Legend has it that a goat herder notices goats becoming more energetic after eating certain beans from a tree. In the 1500s, we see the first coffee house in Istanbul. Coffee emerges in North America in the 1600s, with the first coffee house opening in 1696. And in 1958, the U.S. Congress enacted the Food Additive Amendment. This was in response to the people concerned with having chemicals put in their foods. In 1987, carbonated beverages are not found to cause harm to people's death, but in 2010, the FDA withdrew caffeinated alcoholic beverages from the market. Today, caffeine is considered an additive. It is generally recognized as safe, aka GRAS. In the NCAA, athletes cannot test positive for equivalent of 68 cups of coffee around 500 milligrams of caffeine. Recently, the FDA stated that they will further investigate the efforts of caffeine due to rising concern. In 2011, a 14-year-old girl died consuming 2 24-ounce monsters, around 480 milligrams of caffeine in a 24-hour period. She died from heart arrhythmia due to caffeine toxicity. In the U.S., 80% of adults consume caffeine every day. This table shows that caffeine exposure tends to increase with age. Soft drinks and energy drinks have taken the U.S. by storm, and there is not much done to see what effect the soda, which on average has 35 milligrams of caffeine, can have on kids. So how does caffeine affect the brain? Caffeine prevents the effects that the inhibitory neuromodulator adenosine has on the brain. So let's look at adenosine in the brain first. Throughout the day, our brain uses energy, and neurons use up ATP to drive cellular processes. This results in ATP breakdown and a rise in adenosine, a byproduct of energy metabolism. Since adenosine is an inhibitory neuromodulator, as it builds up, it inhibits more processes. So, how does caffeine come into the picture? Well, let's take a look. Caffeine resembles adenosine. It has the ability to bind to adenosine receptors. Adenosine receptors are G protein-coupled receptors. Caffeine is considered a non-selective adenosine receptor antagonist. In addition, caffeine can promote calcium release from intracellular stores, interfere with GABA-A receptors, and inhibit phosphodiesterase, which break down cAMP. Through antagonism, caffeine affects sleep, cognition, learning, and memory. Outside the CNS, it can increase cortisol levels and adrenaline release, amongst many other things. It is important to keep in mind that there are 4 types of adenosine receptors: A1, A2A, A2B, and A3. A1 and A3 are inhibitory, while A2A and A2B are stimulatory. A1 and A2A are generally found more in the brain, while A2B and A3 are found more in the peripheral system, having been found to be involved with nociception processing. Here, note the distribution and overlap of adenosine A1 receptors in this mouse brain. More so, between A1 and A2A in the brain, A1 receptors have the most abundant distribution and highest concentration in the human brain. This PET scan is of a 70-kilogram person that was administered the equivalent of 4 cups of coffee. Regular consumers of coffee result in a 50% occupancy of the cerebral adenosine receptors. Whoa, that's a lot. This suggests that the cognition-enhancing effects of caffeine are exerted by this adenosine receptor, A1. It has also been suggested that this global caffeine effect may result in adaptive changes. There is evidence that caffeine is protective against neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, but further research is required. Additionally, A1 receptors also interact with neurotransmitter systems, such as with the dopamine system. A1 receptors have been found to interact with D1 receptors and NMDA receptors. For example, A1 receptors have been shown to influence dopamine release in slices of the striatum. But how so? So, D1 receptors are excitatory dopamine receptors, whereas A1 receptors are inhibitory. So if A1 receptor activity is blocked by caffeine, this could result in disinhibition of D1 receptors, therefore resulting in more dopamine release. But we'll see this gets a little tricky later on. Here we see that A2 receptors and D2 receptors have been shown to be closely linked, particularly in the striatum and nucleus accumbens. Remember, these are important for the reward system. A question to consider here is, how does the overlap of A2 receptors and D2 receptors at these regions specifically affect the reward system? In this study, Kralog's technology and RNA interference were used to knock out the A2AR gene for A2A receptors in mice, showing that the expression of A2A receptors by neurons in the shell of the nucleus accumbens is essential for the caffeine-induced arousal. I will now continue to elaborate on the different pathways that caffeine uses to stimulate the brain. So we covered that it might use dopamine for stimulation via adenosine and dopamine receptors. But a plot twist is that caffeine has been shown to decrease the activity of dopaminergic neurons in the VTA. A direct injection of caffeine into the VTA does not increase release of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens. It is suggested that dopamine may not act to stimulate motor behavior by regulating firing of dopamine neurons. So how does caffeine stimulate the brain? One way is through increased release of acetylcholine from the basal forebrain. An increase of adenosine in the basal forebrain means more inhibition of acetylcholine. So if caffeine blocks this adenosine inhibition, more acetylcholine neurons can fire, therefore resulting in wakefulness. Another way is by acetylcholine shutting off the VLPO, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, situated in the anterior hypothalamus. The VLPO is like our sleep switch. It is an area in the hypothalamus containing neurons active during sleep that are GABAergic. These neurons are activated by adenosine. So when caffeine acts on the basal forebrain and increases acetylcholine, this acetylcholine will further inhibit the VLPO, therefore keeping the sleep switch off and you awake. So, is caffeine addictive? Not officially according to national institutes, but it does look addictive to me. One of the stages of addiction is withdrawal, and caffeine does have withdrawal systems, but it also depends on metabolism. If someone has a high rate for caffeine metabolism, they're likely to consume more, therefore it could be at a higher risk of getting addicted. Last but not least, this study found that the intake of 400 milligrams of caffeine during prolonged wakefulness improved PVT performance in non-HT4 carriers, but was ineffective in carriers of HT4 alleles. In other words, when looking at the effect drugs can have on our brain, our genes can definitely play a role.